Hello and welcome to another edition of The Big Opportunity, a ministry of Church of St. John the Divine here in Houston, Texas. My name is Leigh Spruill, your host. Our aim with these video conversations, wherein we're engaging church leaders and thoughtful Christian cultural observers from all over, is to offer encouragement to believers, to members of congregations, to church leaders in this time of immense challenge. There are fresh opportunities, and I thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Anne Snyder. Anne is editor-in-chief of Comment magazine and oversees a partner project there, Breaking Ground, which is a publishing venture that brings together a variety of authors thinking Christianly about so many of our social challenges and crises. And a part of that work involves Anne's hosting a podcast that I encourage you to check out. I listen to it on my iPhone, The Whole Person Revolution. Among Anne's various leadership roles, she's a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. She is a fellow at the Center for Opportunity Urbanism, a Houston-based think tank that explores how cities can drive opportunity for more of their citizens. My viewers here in Texas will be interested to know that from 2014 to 2017, Anne worked for Laity Lodge and the H.E. Butt Family Foundation. Her writings and articles have appeared in a number of publications, including the Atlantic Monthly, the Washington Post, and City Journal. Anne lives in Washington, D.C., and I thank you very much for being my guest today, Anne.
Well, it's my pleasure, Lee. Thank you for having me.
I launched these conversations with a very simple question. From your perspective, especially in light of your many engagements and conversations with so many thoughtful people and Christian leaders, where do you sense fresh opportunity for local congregations and for the church in these times?
I would say, I love the local qualifier because that is where increasingly I just see so much hope. And in some ways, the hope is not new. I think where we are incarnate, where we know our neighbors, where there is a concreteness and sort of tangibility of place, there just tends to be healthier human behavior. I confess, if you were to ask me about like national hope right now or vis-a-vis the church specifically, I would probably have a long pause. It would be trickier to come up with. So we can get into that maybe. But, on the one hand, I'll say a couple things. One is, obviously there's opportunities every day and they're not necessarily fresh. And there's just a basic love your neighbor that I think local congregations always have an ability to encourage their parishioners to do. But I also think, a lot of my own journalistic work has often been fascinated by what I just broadly call the sacred sector, which includes churches like St. John's and many others across denominations, but also includes a lot of faith-based organizations that are working. I actually happened to be in Houston a couple weeks ago reporting on an amazing organization called the Living Hope Wheelchair Association, which is sort of led by a Catholic guy from Mexico. And they're staffed by their entire staff, except for him, are all in wheelchairs. They tend to be undocumented migrants with spinal cord injuries. And yet they wound up sort of emerging as a civic leader post Hurricane Harvey. They were able to reach neighborhoods and certainly demographics that sort of a lot of the city aid services were not able to. I think what's exciting about, or what I love about my sort of perch, is that I'm just really drawn to these never reported upon, long obedience in the same direction, kind of faith-informed organizations that tend to work on the margins, tend to work in unpopular places, but also churches increasingly that I think are figuring out, oh my goodness, we're in this crazy divided era. Our church congregations themselves are being afflicted by this sort of politicization of everything. How do we maybe become, to borrow like a Pope Francis term, a field hospital or a host for a conversation that is not immediately going to be suffocated by the ideological sort of categories, but is going to come from a different sort of moral optic. And I'm seeing more and more churches in cities like Kansas City, Indianapolis, LA, Seattle, serve as like public forums. And that's obviously a little bit more close to my business as a day-to-day role. But that's interesting to me. So if I could land, I guess it would just be this desire to be more of a host than necessarily a battle agent or purely a messenger or even a preacher, but actually some sort of welcoming, gentle space that's patient before deep human difference. And, of course, these days oftenly violently different opinion.
Thank you for that. Great response. And there's a lot there I want to follow up upon, but I fear that I will neglect to give our viewers an opportunity to learn a little bit more about your specific work with Comment Magazine and the Breaking Ground Initiative. Could you share a little bit more about y'all's vision?
Yeah, sure. So Comment is a magazine. It's actually been around since the Cold War, but it's sort of probably taken on more of a public life in the last decade. It is published out of a Canadian think tank named Cardis, but our Comment's largest audience happens to be American, which for whatever reason, many more people know about Comment than know about Cardis in the US. But we sort of serve a think tank whose broad is a Christian think tank in Canada. And the broad mission is sort of this fancy phrase called, we believe in renewing North America, or we exist to renew North American social architecture. So Comment is, the think tank tends to be a little wonky. They focus on policy. We're sort of the more, I like to say, like romantic humanities arm that does, and under my leadership, I think our Comment's tagline is public theology for the common good. So we would like to be read by people who also read the Atlantic Monthly or Hedgehog Review or sort of that middle highbrow cultural criticism. But we're a little distinct in that we really try to bring a constructive imagination to the table that is, of course, like fundamentally oriented in this like deep eschatological hope that God is alive and making all things new, even if we can't see it. And then real quick on Breaking Ground, that was a bit of an uncharacteristic entrepreneurial move on my part. I'm not by personality particularly. I don't do startups. I wish I did, but this situation, COVID happened. And for some reason, I just felt this very deep, strong conviction that I couldn't just continue to lead Comment. I had been reading about pandemics and I just sort of discerned that they tend to further fragment the societies they strike. Was there a way I could set up a more institutionally collaborative forum with other magazines, like Kindred magazines, other think tanks, universities, sacred sector, like networks of faith-based organizations in cities everywhere, to sort of focus in a concentrated way and try to bring the Christian imagination to the chaos of the year. And it turned out it wasn't just COVID, it was George Floyd, it was a political crisis, it was a leadership crisis, economic, et cetera. So we just tried to I created a separate magazine that was more collaborative in nature and more specific to the news cycle, but that was still trying to dwell, a couple miles deep underwater, to look at all that these crises were revealing about our society in the US, and could we perhaps equip particularly people of Christian faith and the church broadly understood to be agile in the face of suffering and to actually lead humbly with some wisdom resources that I think we do possess if we just stop navel gazing. And there's a way to translate that to the broader, our broader democratic sphere.
Yes, I so want local congregations to step more trustingly and with a greater sense of adventure into, sort of agility, adapting to these times. And I wonder, loving our neighbor is not exactly a fresh opportunity, but maybe we can come to that afresh. And I wonder if you might share any kind of concrete examples of where you have seen from your conversations or in church settings what loving our neighbor looks like in this day, especially with those who might be skeptics or unbelievers or nominal to church life.
I mean, in some ways, I sort of see the church almost spilling outside the bounds of the walls of the church these days in very innovative kind of neighborhood, people realizing the value of place, that we can't like sophisticate ourselves or mature ourselves out of just the concrete realities that we're human bodies in a place. I'm thinking of an amazing, it happens to be an organization, but it's more of a neighborly logic that has flourished in Shreveport, Louisiana, not crazy far from Houston, about 5-hour drive. It's called Community Renewal International, and it's basically a reincarnation of Jane Addams' settlement house movement from the early 20th century. And they go beyond sort of dinners with those, across from the socioeconomically other neighborhood across town. They go beyond that to set up block leaders, and they really systematize what, if healthy relationships are the bedrock of a functioning society, what does it look like to nurture that soil so that every single person, regardless of capacity, skill set, background, economics, feels like an agent and feels like a contributing citizen. And they've sort of really almost created a science around what is it to be like a whole city that is like, where the richer neighborhoods are chastened by the poorer neighborhoods and are tutored by. And so anyways, I could talk more about that, but that's one model that I think just feels in some ways so basic. It's not particularly fancy, but it's very comprehensive and intentional.
I'd like to just quickly kind of follow up on that with maybe one last question. And I'm glad to know about that good work going on in Shreveport. Our congregation is engaged in what I hope many more congregations will be doing in this season, and that is having some very serious prayerful conversation and discernment about ways that we can go forth into the city, in this case of Houston, come alongside or partner with others for the common good in some innovative, and I believe that's a word that you used, philanthropic way that is enduring, deepening relationships, changing lives. And I heard you mention, sort of impatience with just having conversation. And again, that's precisely what we want to move beyond. So here's my question. If I gave you 60 seconds to stand in front of our congregation, and if you come to Houston and St. John the Divine, you're going to get a lot more than 60 seconds. But what would be your one encouragement or word of advice given that conversation that we're having here now?
I think I would say, how to put this, on the one hand, the church at its best is a kind of tribe. We have been hopefully experienced an encounter with God that coheres us into the people of God. But at the same, and the church kind of, because of its sacramental practices, even the lowest church has the sacramental quality of life. We offer something distinctive more broadly to the civic square. But I think there's something going on in our moment in time. And I may not say this 50 years from now or 100 years from now, but there's something going on right now. I mean, you're watching the exodus of young people. And I think if I could pinpoint why so many people are upset with the church these days, it's because it's not so much they don't believe in these creedal convictions that are as old as 2,000 years, but it's because they sort of feel like the church itself doesn't believe them anymore. And there's just this deep, I think, sorrow or confusion over words alone and a lack of sort of lived life and authenticity. So I say that to say, there's a part of me, I'm not suggesting getting rid of doctrine or certain essential, truths. And of course, all of this founded on, Christ's commands himself. But I do think there is something about love your God, love your neighbor that sounds so simple that actually are the marching orders for how the churches go out. And there's something about that involves a deep humility. I think, notions of accompaniment and, phrases like, who are you being tutored by? I think those are very important virtues in our moment, to not go out in a triumphalistic way, but if there are resources, human resources, financial, other, very much one of service, seeing the city and the commons as one that is of God's world and is not us versus them, but is rather, the city to which we're called in exile. I guess what I'm trying to say is in some ways a little bit of a dilution, and I might get attacked for saying this, but a little bit of a dilution of we are the church, self-conception, I actually think would be kind of healthy in this moment. And to really come back to an understanding that we sort of have to consider our rights a loss as Christians. We part of our calling is to be resident aliens that are misunderstood and sacrifices involved, et cetera. And so I think just kind of losing the battle imagery and the us versus them would be a major healthy step in the right direction.
Well, good word, Anne Snyder. Thank you so much again for visiting with me, with our viewers today, and I hope that we can do our small part in growing exposure to your great work and ministry. And I want to thank all of our viewers today, especially if this is your first time joining The Big Opportunity. To any and all, share a comment, share this on social media, and if you've not done so already, click the subscribe button there on our YouTube channel. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.